Between what we know and what we cannot hope to know about how we come to be as we are, lies an emotional dumping ground into which exceptional writers pour all the art they are capable of making. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching Leaf by Leaf. Welcome to the fourth episode of the Why We Read Fiction series. Today I'm taking my cue from Vivian Gornick in her book Unfinished Business, Notes of a Chronic Rereader. Vivian Gornick, of course, started her career with The Village Voice. She is also well known as a memoirist, as an essayist, as a literary critic. And as I said at the end of episode 3, I wanted to start to focus on what it is that makes us reread fiction. In this book, which is part literary criticism and part memoir, we get a very practical answer as to why we reread fiction. Gornick sets the theme and the crux of her answer for why we reread and why we should reread fiction in the very opening sentence. It has often been my experience that rereading a book that was important to me at earlier times in my life is something like lying on the analyst's couch. And so this book has two predominant elements to it for me. One focuses on rereading, which is exactly what I wanted to do in this fourth episode. And the other focuses on reading as therapy. So I can already tell you that where we're going to go from here in the next couple episodes, we're going to go into a book that takes an even deeper, more monographed view of rereading. And then we're going to go into a book that does the same thing for the concept of literature as therapy. I really like the way that the book was laid out. Like I said, it's part memoir, part literary criticism. So each section or each essay in this book focuses on books that have been very meaningful to Gornick throughout her life. Books that she's read 2, 3, 4 plus times at different stages in her life. Books that she loved the first time, didn't love so much on subsequent readings, and the opposite. Books that she sort of tossed aside and then came back to later and wondered what in the world her younger self was thinking. Even if you're not reading it to find answers to the question of what causes us, what compels us to reread fiction, if you're reading this just to sample what Gornick has to say about great literature, you will really find a lot in this book. Just in order throughout the book, she takes Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence, The Vagabond and the Shackle by Colette, plus Chérie, The Lover by Marguerite Duras, The Heat of the Day, The Death of the Heart, and The House in Paris by Elizabeth Bowen, The World is a Wedding by Delmar Schwartz, 3 Days and a Child, A Long Hot Day by A.B. Yehoshua, The Solitude of Self by Elizabeth Stanton, Natalia Ginsburg's Essays and Memoir, A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr, Regeneration by Pat Barker, particularly Cats by Doris Lessing, and Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. So got a really great list of books that we get to sample and taste along with Gornick. And some of the things she has to say are just brilliant. For example, this one sentence about the life and ultimately the work of Elizabeth Bowen is brilliant. From the start, she had all the metaphors she needed. Perfect. But I can sense that I'm going into a full-on book review mode. Let me get focused again on why we reread. So it's very practical here. We reread the books that mean a lot to us because we change throughout our lives. And great literature and affecting literature changes along with us. We read fiction as a means to observe and understand ourselves, thus reading literature and really opening ourselves up to characters that are and are not like us and situations that we may or may not face. is a process of self-evaluation, self-analysis, self-discovery. Over and over, Gornick shows how certain characters that she would identify with in a given book, suddenly 10, 20 years later, she would read that book and she'd identify with a totally different character. Or in one book, she talks about how some of the actions of a character seemed to her so thrilling, so visceral and real and powerful. But then 30, 40 years later in her life, they just seemed utterly silly. One way that she characterizes that case in particular is so beautiful. She says, "Between what we know and what we cannot hope to know about how we come to be as we are, lies an emotional dumping ground into which exceptional writers pour all the art they are capable of making." Duras was one of these writers. Another was Elizabeth Bowen, whose power I felt when I was young, but whose value I did not grasp until I was old. And so ultimately, this leads in the latter section of the book to the topic of readiness. Sometimes we simply, in our own selves, haven't grown into the character and maturity and personality that we need to be for certain books, or at least to grasp the value of certain aspects of certain books. She says, "I knew how long and comparatively undamaged a life it took to admit of nuance, take in complexity, and welcome second thoughts." And so this puts a new spin on it, because obviously I think all of us are probably already aware that rereading a book, rewatching a movie, re-listening to music, over time, it yields things that you missed. There's just so much packed into works of art that we can't get it all. We can't process it all the first, second, third, fourth time, whatever. So it was almost easy for me to dismiss some of these arguments as rudimentary or obvious. But when she talks of starting to understand how long and comparatively undamaged a life it took to admit of nuance, take in complexity, and welcome second thoughts, that really made me think that what rereading the great books, especially the complex books, the ones that affect us the most, the ones with the richest imagination, the most detailed situations and characters and atmospheres, rereading cultivates our ability to both notice and appreciate nuance. And it forces us to develop and refine the ability to give things second thoughts. When she's talking about the essays of Natalia Ginzburg, she says, "First time around, my eyes were open to something important about who I was at the moment of reading. Later, to who or what I was becoming. But then I lived long enough to feel a stranger to myself. No one more surprised than me that I turned out to be who I am. And reading Ginsberg again has provided solace as well as revelation." And so there's a lot of emphasis on the time that it takes to cultivate this type of relationship with literature. And it's because literature is as alive as we are. It's growing with us. It's growing alongside us. And what Gornick longs to do is to continually reassimilate these books that mean so much to her so that the books can grow within her. This is why the ancient Greek Longinus, in his great treatise on the sublime, says something to the effect that the reward of old age is sound literary judgment or something like that, because it does take so much time. So many of the books that I have read and connect with, even books that I've read upwards of 5 and 6 times, I can only read them up to the limit of who I am now. Their depth is much greater than my capacity for it. And so I return again and again as I gain this new capacity. The ending to this little book is incredible. she goes and pulls this paperback off of her shelves that's so old it falls apart all over the floor. I mean, the pages just go everywhere. And so she starts to gather these pages and she notices her marginalia and her comments. And she's looking at what she commented and so on these pages, what she underlined, and she's reading it now some 50 years later, and she's thinking, it's so simple and obvious. Why did that mean so much to me? And then her eye will trail over here and read a stray sentence that is much more striking to her. And she thinks, why didn't I underline that? But she says, I put the pages back together in their proper order and sat down to read the book anew, this time underlining and encircling in a pen of another color the sentences and passages that now struck me as worth noting. Then I bound the pages together with a thick rubber band and put the book back on the shelf where it had been sitting all this time. I hope I live long enough to read again, with a pen of yet another color in hand. And I've talked about this in some videos. I can't remember, some QA videos, maybe in my On Reading Big Books videos, but I've talked about how I actually do that same practice. So it was really neat to see it affirmed in someone the caliber of Vivian Gornick. Each time I read a book, I use a different color pen or highlighter or notes or whatever, so as to capture the different me's, the different Chris's, I guess, that have journeyed along with the book. And with the best books, every time I close them, I say, just like Vivian Gornick when she closes Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, I wonder if I've finally exhausted all it has to say to me. So like I said, Vivian Gornick has presented us with a forked path now. One, we go down even deeper into rereading. The other, we go deeper into books and literature as therapy. So in the next episode, we'll take that path down into rereading a little deeper.